welcome everybody back to this week's meeting of 493-593 and our discussion of the Arab Spring. Thanks for being here last week and also for your questions with Mark Tesler. I hope you had a chance to explore his website more too and follow up with any extra questions you had with him. He's always open for more, so if you want to contact him or talk to him and use his lecture as one of the basis for your upcoming paper, that would be good. I wanted to just signal to everybody that next week, which will be what, the 12th of October, your second response is due. So please post that before class next week. And it's just the same format, same prompt as the first, except that instead of talking about films, which is what you did for the first one, talking about the first film and the readings that accompanied it, this time I want you to choose between 1 and 3 of the talks that we've heard so far. You can choose up to 3, but only focus on 1 if you want, and compare them or talk about any of the issues they raised. So you can focus just on 1 or compare and contrast as you like. Try to bring in the readings as well as the actual talk, and you can go back and look at the recordings of the talks if you want to refresh your memory about what happened. We're also going to be having a meeting next week, although it's not on the syllabus, but we've sort of done an ad hoc meeting with Omar Effendum, the musician, who's going to be here to do a Q&A with our class and a couple other classes at 4 o'clock to talk about the album and just about being a Syrian-American rap artist and hip-hop artist in the US. If you want, you can go listen to his album on Spotify. The whole thing is on Spotify. I think it's also available for purchase on maybe Apple Music or whatever. So there are a few samples online for free as well if you don't have those services. Or just buy it since it's all available and on sale and it's really good. But please be here at 4. And it would be good if you could just familiarize yourself with some of his music beforehand if you didn't go to the launch party and hear some of his songs. So we'll have a brief Q&A discussion with him till 5 only. He's not going to give a talk, but it'll just be a chat with him to talk about the role of music and art and his perspective on the Arab Spring in particular and what it's meant to produce an album 10 years ago and now to see sort of the major changes that have happened in the last 10 years. So those are the things on the agenda. We'll see you here next week. And your response paper should be due before you come to that again. So otherwise, we'll get started. I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker this week. Sasha Krasnow is lecturer in Islamic arts in the residential college, and she's affiliate faculty at the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies here, and also in Arab and Muslim American Studies, the AMAS program. She received a PhD in art history from the University of California, San Diego. And her research focuses on contemporary art, mostly with a focus on issues related to contemporary socio-political, critical race studies, gender and sexuality studies in the Swana region. And her book manuscript, which is currently under review, maybe she can give us an update if there's any good news, is called The Age of Disillusionment right now, Palestinian Art After the Intifadas. And it examines the effect of the inter-intifada period and the failure of the peace process on Palestinian art production after 2000. So that sounds really excellent and really interesting, and I'm certainly excited to see it. She's recently published an article on the use of hybrid mythological figures among queer and non-binary Swana artists in the Journal of Visual Culture, and has a number of other things published or forthcoming, articles and chapters on different subjects of interest, such as Mizrahi culture in Israel, the role of trans studies in art history, and other really interesting topics related to these different topics, as well as what she's going to talk about today, which is art and the intersectional revolution, gender and sexuality in the legacy of the Arab Spring. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Sasha and be ready with questions afterwards. So you can also jot down questions while she's speaking and be ready for a robust discussion. Take it away, Sasha. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ryan, so much for that introduction. And thank you all for having me here today. I don't have huge updates on most of that information, but inshallah by the end of the year. So as Ryan said, today my talk is called Art in the Intersectional Revolution, Gender and Sexuality and the Legacy of the Arab Spring. And I'm going to talk today about artists whose works engage in expressions around gender and sexuality in the aftermath and legacy of the Arab Spring, with a specific focus on Tunisia and Egypt. To do this, I'm going to start by laying out some of the protesters' calls around gender and sexuality during the Arab Spring in these countries, and what the dynamics surrounding gender and sexuality were during the protests. Then I will look at how artists responded to these changing realities during the revolution, as well as in the years since, especially as relate to changes that were or were not implemented as a result of the Arab Spring. I also just want to take a minute to note kind of issuing a content warning at the start that this lecture will include the discussion of sexual assault and suicide. And as Ryan said, please feel free to drop any questions in the chat throughout the talk, and I know there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. While the so-called Arab Spring is often characterized as a call for political revolution, the ousting of autocratic leaders and desire for regime change, which it certainly was, for many it also inspired a drive for social revolution. Given the way social norms and behaviors are often regulated by governments, this makes a lot of sense. And indeed, for many, these two calls were in fact inherently intertwined. The incident that sparked what would later become known as the Arab Spring, the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, has largely been characterized as an act against a corrupt government and its officials, a protest against the confiscation of his wares for his inability to provide the proper permitting or sufficient bribe to allow him to continue to sell products as a street vendor. However, there is a gender dimension to this event that has at times been overlooked. As political scientist and gender studies scholar Norma Claire Maruzzi has argued, quote, Bouazizi did not set himself on fire simply because he was denied the right to make a living. He set himself on fire because a woman allegedly slapped him in the face, end quote. While the actualities of what transpired between Municipal Inspector Faida Hamdi and her two male colleagues and Bouazizi may never be definitively known, the narratives that arose in the aftermath are informative in understanding the gendered dynamics of the autocratic Tunisian society at the time. As Maruzzi notes, quote, virtuous, honest, and hardworking masculinity publicly humbled by a feminine manifestation of corrupt state power. This was the tale that set off the protests that eventually brought down the Tunisian government, end quote. While the harassment of the working class was common under the Ben Ali regime, this narrative claimed it was the affront to Bouazizi's sovereign masculinity that led to his protest of self-immolation. However, after a series of arrests and releases, and after Zine El Abidine Ben Ali's deposal, Faida Hamdi revealed her side of the story. When she confronted Bouazizi, he had grabbed her breasts. The narrative then moved from one of a gratuitous insult to masculine dignity into one of an improper affront to feminine modesty. This complication allowed for the supremacy of issues of representation and electoral politics to supersede these other narratives. Tunisian women held rights related to gender equality prior to the revolution, including the ability to ask for divorce, vote, seek office, and gain access to birth control and abortion, in part due to longstanding secularism in the country. And after the revolution, they gained equity in inheritance laws, and the principle of parity was invoked to give women equal representation on ballots in the formation of the new government. However, the rise of the Salafist movement, which sought the creation of an Islamic state, at least in the immediate few years after the revolution, concerned some women that despite their roles in the revolution, they would lose the gains they had won and perhaps even some long-standing rights. The energy of solidarity and collectivity in the public sphere generated by the revolution was picked up by women artists in the years immediately following. As art historian and gender studies scholar Anne-Marie Butler has noted, while prior to the revolution, contemporary art, and in particular performances, had typically taken place within the context of festivals, in the years immediately following the revolution, These performances took on forms similar to the revolutionary protests themselves by moving into the streets. In Sana Tamzini's Hor 1, a group of people consisting of the artist and her friends and students moved through the narrow city streets of the Medina, the old city, as a single unit, joined together in their encasement in a large white fiberglass structure resembling a cloud. The communal nature of the project, articulated in the physical unification of the participants within the sculptural cloud form, recalls the communal nature of the protests, their collective movements through the Medina streets, mirroring the filling of the streets by the collective presence of the people in protest. The binding of the individuals together within the sculptural cloud-like structure also makes visible the "we're all in this together" aspect of solidarity in the revolutionary calls for justice, equity, and freedom from authoritarian rule. The title itself is worthy of further reflection within the context of the revolution, and in particular with regard to gender dynamics. Hor means freedom in Arabic and denotes both the goals of the revolution and the collective feeling of those who were calling for an end to Ben Ali's regime once he had stepped down. As Butler remarks, quote, "Additionally, in Tunisian dialect, the feminine variant hora denotes a strong and capable woman. A strong and capable Tunisian woman might be one who has a notable career, takes care of her family, stands up for herself and others, and participates in the revolution," end quote. In this way, Tamzini marks herself as a hora, as well as the other Tunisian women who are able to call for the type of future that they want. Huda Ghorbel and Wadi Miri's performance Sous mon drapeau from 2012, Under My Flag, also calls upon imagery of protest, though this time in the aftermath of the revolution, as well as collective participation in its realization in the public sphere. As mentioned briefly earlier, in the immediate few years after the revolution, the Salafist movement gained in popularity. In the town of Sejnan, the increased presence of Salafists impeded the local craft market. The pottery produced by the women there, known as the potiers de Sejnan, are known and treasured throughout the country. The increased Salafist presence interrupted the production of these crafts, threatening their value, as well as the potential dissemination of the practice. Additionally, as the region's economic welfare is based in tourism driven by the local crafts, the Salafist presence interrupted the flow of income into the region in another way. As part of their attempt to assert their presence in the region, on March 7, 2012, a Salafist man climbed onto the roof of the university to replace the Tunisian flag with a Salafist one. Khawla Rashidi, seen in the image here, also climbed onto the roof to stop the man from completing his task. Her intervention was lauded and seen as an act of heroism in defending the ideals of the revolution. She was honored by then President Monsef Marzouki on the 12th of March of that year. Sous mon drapeau honors and brings together the women-led resistance of Rashidi and the Potiers de Sejnan in a public performance. In the performance, the women artisans gathered together under a large Tunisian flag, complete with outlets from which their heads could protrude. And I'm actually going to show a brief, about 1-minute clip of the actual documentation from the performance. The audio might be a little quiet, but mainly I'm just interested in you seeing how this actually looks when they're in motion.
في تونس من خانها ولا عاش من ليس من جندها نموت ونحيا على عهدها حياة الكرام وموت العظام.
Much like the cloud in Hor 1, the flag encompasses the women, bringing them all together in a collective. demonstrating their solidarity and strength as a unit, and as active members in the formation of a post-revolutionary Tunisia. The use of the Tunisian flag gestures toward Rashidi's action, and the participation of the craftswomen makes present their own parallel actions in resistance to the Salafist presence in the region. It also centralizes the role of women, not only in the revolution, but in the formation of the post-revolutionary Tunisian state. This was emphasized by the presence of many women's children, as you can see some of them holding their hands in the still image here. So this was emphasized by the presence of many women's children who, seeing their mothers participate in the performance, also wanted to march underneath the flag. The inclusion of the children gestures to the role of women not only as active participants in the revolution and formation of the post-revolutionary nation, but also as individuals who are shaping the future of the nation through the next generation of its citizens. This is further emphasized by the fact that as the women marched underneath the flag, they began to sing the Tunisian anthem, the words of which were sung and shouted during the revolutionary protests. And if the audio wasn't working, that's what you could hear, is the chanting kind of singing of the Tunisian national anthem. The inclusion of the anthem and the flag, both typically nationalist signifiers, indicate the conception of Tunisian nationalism as one of the people, rather than of a particular government. The performance also challenges typically masculinist narratives of nationalism that conceptualize a masculine nation protecting the feminized land. Artists also address issues of gender as well as religious and ethnic identifications in the wake of the revolution in non-performative work. Fatin Gaddis's Punching Ball from 2011 is an installation of 4 punching bags assembled hanging in a boxing ring. A photograph of the artist appears on each of the bags, with her hair arranged to resemble a hijab or headscarf, the rest of her visible body uncovered. On each of the 3 of the portraits appear text in French which read respectively, Je suis Tunisienne, Je suis chrétienne, Je suis juive. I am Tunisian, I am Christian, I am Jewish. In place of her pupils and irises are a corresponding symbol, the red and white crescent and star of the Tunisian flag, a cross, and the Star of David. On the opposing side of the bag appears an image of the artist from the back, marked by the red and white Tunisian crescent and star, and labeled Made in Tunisia. The 4th bag has profile images of the artist on either side, with a longer text listing numerous declarations of identity, national, religious, secular, and concluding with, Je suis une femme qui respire, qui pète, qui chie. I am a woman who breathes, who farts, who shits. The artist made the work in response to an interaction she had with someone while participating in a demonstration calling for secularism. She was approached by someone who asked her a question, suggesting that she must not be Tunisian. When she stated that she was, the individual asked if she were Christian or Jewish. The presumption was that she could not possibly be a Tunisian Muslim woman and be calling for secularism. Gaddis's text-overlaid portraits then are, as French studies and visual arts scholar Siobhan Shilton has noted, a, quote, call for women to be seen as embodied individuals rather than as symbols of a mythical, unified national or religious identity, unquote. Gaddis's works ask viewers to reconsider their assumptions about Tunisians, and particularly Tunisian women, and calls for them to be allowed to speak for themselves. In the use of the punching bag and boxing ring as the form in which to display these images, Gaddis gestures to the aggression she felt during her exchange at the protest and the barrage of assumptions and projected meanings to which Tunisian women are subject. While performances in the immediate years after the revolution moved outside the confines of the festival format, in 2013, a new festival, Jau Tunis, was established by the Kamel Lazar Foundation. The festival brought together a wide range of artists, largely from the Swana or MENA region. Various iterations have incorporated themes and works responding to the changing realities of post-revolutionary Tunisia. For example, in 2015, the festival was delayed when the month it was set to open, the Bardo Museum, which was slated as the site for the festival, became the site of a terrorist attack that left 21 people, mostly tourists, dead. The attack was claimed by ISIL, though the Tunisian government blamed an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, and the attack, as well as one later that year at a resort, are indicative of the more recent battle that secularist Tunisia is up against, the infiltration of foreign or foreign-trained extremist groups manifesting in shootings and suicide bombings into this year. In spite of the 2015 attack, rather than canceling, the organizers, led by Lina Lazar, presented an exploration of the possibilities of a secular Islam in Tunisia through the exhibition All the World's a Mosque, which opened with a female-led call to prayer, drawing threats of attack from Islamic fundamentalists who were only calmed when a local Grand Imam blessed the site. The 2018 version of the festival continued its engagement with the ongoing realities of post-revolutionary Tunisian life and its interplay with gender. It included a mixed media installation by Moroccan artist Iman Fakhir entitled The Lion's Share, which combines sculpture, video, photography, and text to tell the story of inheritance in a Muslim family. Amel Benatia, who had curated this portion of the festival in which Fakhir's work was situated, noted that she had been thinking about the proposals for gender equity laws in Tunisia when deciding to incorporate this work. The laws, amendments to which had recently been proposed, were based on text in the Quran that states that women could only inherit half of what men could. Later in 2018, inheritance laws in Tunisia would be changed to create parity between men and women inheritors. Similar to Tunisia, the Egyptian revolution and occupation of Tahrir Square brought into the streets large numbers of women. A young woman, Asma Mahfouz, is credited with helping to start the protests with the vlog posted to Facebook 1 week before the start of the revolution. The 18 days of protests that led to Hosni Mubarak's resignation were characterized by a conspicuous lack of harassment for women. As one activist remarked, quote, "These were the only 18 days in my life in Egypt that I wasn't harassed at all," end quote. However, the night that Mubarak fell, there was a turn. As CBS correspondent Lara Logan was assaulted, her visibility as a journalist, as well as the fact that she was working for a US-based news organization, not to mention being a white blonde woman, caused this attack to be prominently covered. Subsequently, attacks on women became prominent, including the March 2011 attack on a demonstration celebrating International Women's Day. The most notorious of these attacks was on the Blue Bra Girl, a woman who was dragged by army soldiers through the streets by her abaya, causing it to rise up, exposing her torso and blue bra. Much like Hamdi's accusation of Bouazizi's assault, this event and the subsequent distributed images of it, as scholars Nicola Pratt and Sarah Salem put it, quote, violated dominant codes of female modesty and male gallantry, end quote. Video footage and imagery of the event circulated across media. The protester began to be referred to as Sit al-Banat, the best of all girls, reinforcing this idea that her modesty, evident in its violation, elevated her to a high-valued status. Large numbers of women took to the streets in reaction to the event in protest, indicating that the army had crossed a red line with its people in the assault. Given the number of people, both men and women, who were attacked by the army, the fact that this incident garnered such public outcry belies the gendered respectability politics in it. The image of the woman in the blue bra, as well as the Sit al-Banat, became fixtures of graffiti art, the most widely visible and prevalent art form during the revolution, for which the immediacy of the medium lends itself to responding to the revolution as it happens. For some women, it also became a means through which to reclaim public space from which the assaults had attempted to keep them. Bahia Shahab utilized the imagery of the blue bra as a symbol in part of her larger series, No and 1,000 Times No, referencing an Arabic expression used to convey a negative statement with certainty. In the series, the artist utilized various forms of stylized lam alifs, the two letters that comprise the word la, no, in Arabic, to make various statements of negation against actions the army took against the people during the revolution and its aftermath. These include statements such as no to snipers and no to military rule. The las are stylized after historic art objects and architectural forms that have incorporated the word no into the form and design. Given the inclusion of it in the Shahada, there is no God but God, this was quite a common occurrence. However, the stylization of them and pairing with their statements often accentuates visual qualities that relate to their content. For example, the la in No to Snipers on the left here appears to mimic the visual imagery of long-range guns. Shahab incorporated the imagery of the blue bra within her stencils that make up No 1,000 Times No. While sometimes the bra appeared alone, in other instances it was paired with a statement, no to stripping the people, and long live a peaceful revolution. While the stylized la is modeled after a 7th century Islamic tomb, the appendages that droop and protrude from it in the context of the blue bra and assault of a woman, sit al-banat, by male army officers, appear like male genitals, making Shahab's no read as a challenge to the masculinist aggressive forces that would strip the people, in particular women, of the revolution. Additionally, the bra itself, with its mirror image form made up of the straps descending into cups and an adjoining midpoint, functions as a stylized la in and of itself. The bra, whether it appears with the textual accompaniments or not, therefore functions as both a reminder of the event, inducing shame, a powerful tool, particularly in the Arab world, in those who might have reason to identify with the perpetrators, and as a visual statement against those sorts of violations. The blue bra becomes a symbol of resistance. The reminder of the event is accentuated by the stylization of the statement, long live a peaceful revolution, into the boot print that sits below the bra, recalling the violent kicks and stomps the army rained down upon Sit al-Banat and others like her, and a call against such actions. Other groups, like graffiti harimi, female graffiti, have pushed women to get involved in graffiti as a means to reclaim public space. Some images feature significant and powerful Egyptian women, like iconic singer Kulthum, who is featured above a line from The Ruins from Ibrahim Naji's poem, "Give me my freedom, set loose my chains." Other images feature types of women rather than individuals. One image depicts 3 faceless women's heads, one uncovered, one wearing the hijab, and the third wearing the niqab. Underneath, the women reads, "Don't label me." Similar to Fatin Gaddas's punching ball, the work calls on others to not label or make assumptions about women based on what level of covering they choose to adopt. It also signals the significance of the inclusion of all women's voices together in solidarity against those who would label them, demonstrating broader female solidarity and community. In the years following the revolution, the election of Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, and military coup leading to his ousting and military control of the government led by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, women artists continue to engage with the dynamics of gender in the post-revolutionary context within the more formal gallery space. On the 3rd anniversary of the revolution, artist Huda Lutfi opened her exhibition, Cut and Paste, at the Townhouse Gallery in Cairo. The exhibition was Lutfi's reflection on, as art historian Margot Badram puts it, her, quote, growing concern with patriarchal power and its tentacles, whether masculinist power over women, or the power of one class over the other, or one generation over the other, and with that pinnacle of patriarchal power, the state, end quote. Lutfi references the outrage of women demonstrators after the attack on Sit al-Banat that the army had crossed a red line and their assault of the woman in her photo montage work, Crossing the Red Line, from 2011. In the work, Lutfi placed the heads of women and some men from photographs she took in and around Tahrir Square, as well as pictures of notable women like Kulthum and Sali Zahran, a martyr of the revolution, on the bodies of policemen. These figures were placed one next to the other in profile in close proximity, creating the visual effect of patrolling along red lines, which, cutting them at mid-shin, they appear to stand behind. The police uniforms were also modified. Their armbands read Slimia, peaceful, and a white dove, a symbol of peace, appeared on their hats. In her imaging of policing, Lutfi reconceptualizes what a feminized regulatory body might look like, and how this red line might be placed and defined differently by women. As Badran notes, Lutfi, quote, turns the notion away from guarding to guiding. The women are leading people toward a better social order. Additionally, the figures carry walkie-talkies rather than weapons. This also may gesture toward a shift from threats of violence and weaponry to threats of accountability in communication and public dissemination of information. It may also be a broader reference to how technology was used in the revolution, specifically the internet and cell phones, in order to organize as well as spread information. The use of technology, and specifically cell phones, during the revolution is also utilized by artist Mahmoud Khaled in his work, Do You Have Work Tomorrow? However, rather than a reference to its use in spreading information during the revolution, Khaled explores navigating queer relationships against the backdrop of revolutionary Cairo. Under the Mubarak regime, LGBTQ rights were not supported, and while not explicitly illegal, a 1961 regulation aimed at targeting sex work that referenced debauchery has been used to target, arrest, and prosecute LGBTQ individuals or those identified as such. Prior to the revolution, the most notorious of such event involved the so-called Cairo 52. On May 11, 2001, police raided the Queen Boat, a gay-friendly floating nightclub on a boat in the Nile. A number of men were arrested, and ultimately 52 were tried for habitual practice of debauchery. The incident made international news, in particular because the 52 men's faces and names were published in Egyptian newspapers, and reports indicating torture that stated that the men were subject to tests to prove their homosexuality. Much like women, LGBTQ individuals were also mobilized to take part in the revolution and to see the potential in this moment for change. While local organizations have begun to be more engaged with LGBTQ rights along with other human rights concerns, there is little tangible change that has occurred. A more recent incident and its lasting effects belies this. In September 2017, a number of young Egyptians raised rainbow flags during a Mashru Leila concert, a band known for its promotion of LGBTQ rights, led by openly gay frontman Hamed Sino. Images of these individuals began circulating on social media and then television, and their personal information was exposed. By the end of November, at least 75 people were arrested. Many stated that they were tortured with tests of homosexuality and in some cases, electric shocks. One of the young women who raised a flag at the concert, Sarah Higazi, had been arrested and tortured in prison for 3 months and ultimately sought asylum in Canada in 2018. However, the impact of her continued trauma from the imprisonment and torture, as well as feelings of isolation being far away from Egypt, ultimately led to her death by suicide in June of this year. This need for secrecy and risk of exposure mixes with the desire for connection in the tense moments of the revolution in Mahmoud Khaled's Do You Have Work Tomorrow from 2013. The work consists of 32 black and white photographs, screenshots of a conversation on the gay dating hookup app Grindr between 2 men discussing the volatility of their particular moment, the revolution, while trying to simultaneously flirt with the hopes of arranging a meeting for sex. The conversation, while based on a real experience, is completely staged. Khaled wrote the script and played it out on 2 iPhones, alternating between them himself. The conversation shifts back and forth between flirtation and discussions of politics as the moment's realities filter in. One of the men states that he's on the street protecting his building with some neighbors. While no overt mention of when the conversation is taking place occurs, this mention of protecting his building indicates that this exchange is taking place in the days following the Day of Rage, the 4th day in Egypt's revolution, when police retreated and the prison system broke down, releasing thousands of inmates in what was seen as a state-sponsored move to destabilize the country further. With the absence of the police, citizens took control of their neighborhood's safety themselves, organizing into groups to protect their homes. Class differentiations are drawn out, as while one of the men is part of one of these groups, the other rests at home, his building protected by hired security. The man on the street, as well as his neighbors, embody the dominant notions of masculinity as protectionist, especially of women, the stability of which is played with in the fact that the man on the street is also engaging in a homosexual flirtation, as hegemonic masculinity is often rooted in a distinctly heteromasculinity. The recommendation that if the other man wants to come meet the man on the street, that he should carry a knife, metal, or wooden stick also elicits a phallic image that associates this protectionism with masculinity, while at the same time also suggests the potential that these weapons be a stand-in not just for the own man's phallus, but for that of his potential lover. The conversation eventually moves to a discussion of meeting in the homebound man's car. He notes that it's the only place that he feels comfortable meeting new dates. The seclusion from family members' prying eyes, as well as the freedom of mobility the car allows, points to the need for privacy in navigating same-sex relations in Egypt. These notions of privacy are also highlighted through their violation in the display of the screenshots as framed photographs in the gallery space. These screenshots are ostensibly private conversations taking place in the ephemeral medium of the phone conversation. However, by taking screenshots, turning them into photographs, and placing them on the gallery walls for public audiences to see, Khaled makes them both public and gives them tangible permanence. As the artist has noted, quote, "Retaining the text taken out of the phone is a very violent act, because all the texts we have are very private. Taking someone else's phone and looking at the conversations they've had on Grindr or WhatsApp is a very violent act. So taking this and putting it into a gallery was a way of trying to stress the tension between public and private in the materiality of the text." Knowing the way that private information from phones, including images, have been utilized by military and policing forces to target, jail, and harm LGBTQ individuals in Egypt, the potential risk in this exposure accentuates this tension. At the same time, the framing of these screenshots and placing them on the gallery wall elevates them to a place of cultural and monetary value. In this, the relationships between LGBTQ individuals, even in their most quotidian form, are given a place of value to be cherished. The use of black and white photography, developed in a dark room, also elevates the work, both through the effort and care of process, as well as the aesthetic history of black and white photography. The black and white photography also serves to decontextualize the conversation from a specific time and place, especially as there is no explicit reference to Cairo or the revolution. Khaled also notes that without the black and white process, the layout of Grindr, which has changed since the work was made, gives away when it must have been made. This decontextualization gives an aspect of universality to the conversation, two people trying to find comfort in each other during a tense political moment. At the same time, art critic Shahab Awad suggests that, noting this decontextualization across a number of Khaled's works, it may also be, quote, "a safety measure to avoid attracting unwanted attention to himself and his work," remarking that when he first saw the work in Cairo, he thought it was, quote, "risky to be showing such explicitly queer work, even in an artist-run apartment gallery with appointment-only visiting hours," end quote. In Tunisia as well, there is no explicit law against same-sex relationships broadly. However, there is a sodomy law threatening up to 3 years in prison that, while not frequently enforced under Ben Ali's regime, was still a constant threat, leading much of LGBTQ life to exist in secret. In the wake of Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali's removal from office, there was some optimism that a new government might finally lead to the decriminalization of same-sex relationships. However, the subsequent years have been largely disappointing. While greater organization has developed among LGBTQ individuals online, including the formation of Association Shams, a nonprofit NGO that campaigns for LGBTQ rights, and the launch of Gay Day online magazine, until recently, many of these efforts have often been forced to remain online for safety reasons. In 2012, Samir Dilou, Tunisia's human rights minister, rejected the notion of decriminalizing same-sex acts, calling homosexuality something that required medical treatment. Since the revolution, there has also been an increase in arrests and imprisonment of LGBTQ individuals, as well as those perceived as such, and the practice of anal probes as homosexuality tests, the refusal of which has led to a presumption of guilt. However, in recent years, LGBTQ organizations, individuals, and events in Tunisia have staked out a more visible presence. For example, in 2018, Mawjoudeen, Arabic for We Exist, a nonprofit, successfully launched the first iteration of its queer film festival. It has continued this in subsequent years, though not without meeting with regular resistance, only delaying this year's festival iteration due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of the persistent resistance to LGBTQ rights in Tunisia, for some artists like Aisha Snoussi, the revolution stands separate from her work, which she sees as part of a lifelong revolution she has been waging herself. As Snoussi remarks, quote, "The revolution was a very special moment because we felt something huge. We felt all connected and we had no clue of what was going to come after, but I really can't connect it to my work because I started my own revolution as I was growing up by saying no to my father, for example. When I was young, I've always wondered why there are rules for girls and not for guys. In Tunisia, you start a revolution when you talk about sex or gender because you can't live your sexuality freely," end quote. The artist, who is based in Paris and Tunis, remarks on the persistence of the Tunisian legal system that threatens up to 3 years in jail for same-sex acts, noting that for her, the revolution started in childhood and is still ongoing, as there's more change still to come. Snoussi is most well known for her large-scale drawing installations, both on paper, in notebooks or scrolls, as well as on the gallery walls themselves. As a child, she often collected things including shells and rocks. She became interested in the idea of the archaeologist, not just of objects in the world, but of things inside herself. She states, quote, "During the years of my artistic training at art school, I also began to discover myself and my sexuality. My lifestyle and my ideas were developed by culture and tradition, but when I understood that it wasn't really me, I also started to archaeologically look inside myself. I found out a lot of things, especially when it comes to sexual fluidity and eroticism, pleasure, pain, and all of that," end quote. Snoussi explores these ideas in works like the Book of Anomalies from 2017, an installation of a series of notebooks opened to ink drawings depicting images of an unidentifiable, but at least partially recognizable nature. They depict what appear to be hybrids, combining together elements of human, animal, plant, and machine. Snoussi has noted her interest in the work of feminist scholar Donna Haraway, who wrote the Cyborg Manifesto. Quote, "I like the idea to abolish all distinctions between women and men, animals and humans, nature and culture. There's no hierarchy, but a kind of network in which everything is connected." The drawings make reference in particular to both female genitalia as well as phallic shapes. In combining all these elements, a challenge to existing hierarchies, Anne-Marie Butler suggests that Snoussi presents an alternative way of being, and through the use of the notebooks and their association with knowledge acquisition and distribution, an alternative way of knowing. She continues, noting that in the use of anomalies, Snoussi evokes deviance, a term that has been applied to queer actors and which some have adopted as a means by which to challenge the social order. Boundaries between gender, species, as well as pleasure and pain are blurred, conventions and assumptions challenged, and a codex of creatures that make up a new world and the possibility of the social order that might come along with it are revealed. In this way, Snoussi continues her personal revolution to imagine a new social order not just in Tunisia, but beyond. There are some artists who have been more publicly visible in their queerness in Tunisia in the post-revolutionary context. Houha Maquir is one of the first openly non-binary trans individuals in Tunisia. Their art primarily consists of drag performances and digital media visible in online platforms such as Instagram. Because the laws against sodomy are often used to target gay Tunisians, largely men, LGBTQ rights organizations in Tunisia have tended to rest their focus on that narrative. As a result, Houha noted that trans individuals were often left out of the conversation in queer spaces. Visibility, both within these organizations and within Tunisia writ large, are at the center of much of their work. Through making expanded notions of gender more visible, Houha aims to challenge existing conceptions of gender embedded in Tunisian society. Znous 2 from 2016 is part of a larger project documenting gender nonconforming and queer individuals in Tunisia. Znous depicts one such individual, Aya, standing in front of a blue wooden door. A red cap on their head and red checkered scarf around their neck, they hold a cigarette in their hand that appears on its way to their slightly parted lips. Dressed in a white button-down shirt and a denim jacket and pants, their mustache gestures toward masculinity, while a more feminine body shape is still visible despite the largely loose-fitting clothes. There is clearly a play with gender here. Butler has broken down the gendered as well as national elements in the work, noting that the red wool cap, known as a sheshia, as well as the styling of the mustache and the cigarette, serve as long-standing visible cultural markers of Tunisian masculinity. While smoking in general is taboo for women and seen as a rite of passage for men, even the way that Aya is holding the cigarette is relevant. Quote, holding the cigarette with a thumb and forefinger signals a masculine assertiveness. These elements reference not only gender, but a specifically Tunisian context. Hucha draws out the importance of highlighting this visibility in Tunisia specifically. This is driven home further by Aya's placement in front of the bright blue door that would be immediately recognizable as the type one would see in the Tunis Medina, or Old City, notably also a more conservative space within the city. As Butler notes, the portrait then insists on the acknowledgement of the presence of queer and gender nonconforming individuals within Tunisia. The title of the series, Znus, also references the need for an acknowledged visibility of queer and gender nonconforming individuals in Tunisia, but also seeks to take ownership of the narrative and naming and place it in the hands of those individuals. As Hucha explained to Butler, quote, the expansive plural of jins, sex, which is junus, is never used to describe human sexes. Junus is the Arabic root of the word znus, and znus is meant to say and to be understood in other Arab countries as multiple sexes and genders. As janus, which comes from junus, has been used by some in the Persian Gulf as a slur for gender nonconforming individuals, znus reappropriates the term as a means to celebrate the diversity in gender expression that exists in Tunisia. The artists and work I've discussed today are just some of those that are tackling the legacy of the Arab Spring Revolution as they relate to their and others' experiences of gender and sexuality. As we have seen, it is worthwhile to consider the Arab Spring Revolutions through the lens of gender dynamics from the start. These analyses reveal more than just information about how gender plays out in a given moment. They are also informative for understanding the broader dynamics of sociocultural life leading up to and during these revolutions. While the focus has often been on that most visible of change and revolution, the deposal of an existing leader, the social calls that came from protesters with regard to rights for women and LGBTQ folks, as well as challenges to normative and military masculinity, were an important dynamic of the revolution as it happened and continue to be significant in the legacy as it continues to unfold. Whether artists are making explicit reference to the revolution and utilizing their work as part of their protest, or they are expressing their own ongoing lived revolution as someone who the social norms restrict, their works offer a glimpse into the lived realities of the contemporary histories of the Arab world and the legacy of the Arab Spring. Thank you.